Welcome to this episode of Chatting with Staxx. I'm your host, Bill Staxx, and today I got Mooch.
Hey,
What's up?
what's up, man?
How you doing?
Good. Happy to be back on.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Yeah, you have a crazy story, and we're going to get into some of the tales that you've been in, some of the craziness. One of the first things I want to ask you is, I know that you were hanging out with like the skinhead types when you were younger, right? What
Right.
was your first introduction to the one percenter lifestyle?
My dad grew up kind of around the local club, which was the Gypsy Jokers in Oregon. So, my dad had friends that would come over and stuff. My dad was out riding around quite a bit. So probably from a really, really young age, I would see it. I just didn't know much about it. And then as I got older in that punk rock and skinhead, kind of movement, a lot more people in that area were kind of graduating out of that into motorcycle clubs. So there was a lot of overlaps. A lot of the homies from FSU were going into the Outlaws, and most hated and the dudes from NorCal were hanging out the Angels and East Bay Rats. And so there was starting to be kind of like, it was starting to be more prevalent in my world. And I was starting to see more of it.
And was there a big divide because these people are going with different clubs?
I didn't know enough about the political side of it back then. Really, it was more kind of regional. So, like, the FSU dudes were in Boston and upstate, and that's the Outlaws where I was at in that area, and that's where they went. And before they went to clubs, we were all friends, right? We all came from the same scene. We did a lot of things together, toured a lot together, played music together. So it was kind of more regional. It kind of just depended on like who was in what area. Usually, it was like one guy from that group went and joined whatever dominant club was there, and then his friends followed. So it really wasn't divided yet because we didn't know a lot about the politics or the who was who.
And you were in Oregon, right?
Yeah.
At first.
Yep. Yeah.
So what was your first introduction to the Vagos?
Vagos I met when I was in Nevada. So the first club I met in Oregon was the Outsiders. That was a club that I first hung around with and prospected for a little bit. And they were a club that's been in Portland since the 60s. They've been there forever, and they're a very old school chopper club. And one of the guys was working at the local Harley dealership when I bought my first bike. So he worked at the parts counter. I'd go up there and buy parts for my bike, and we'd shoot the shit. And he ended up inviting me out to start hanging around. And, I was really excited to do that because, I was just getting into riding. But same thing with like Gang World or anything else. Once I was in, I was all in. So when I started riding, I was super interested in motorcycle clubs. I just didn't know enough of much about it. So it took a chance to meet one, and he invited me out, and I started going to their clubhouse and their events and on their rides, and learned a lot that way. But eventually ended up moving to Nevada for work, and so I left the Outsiders.
But you were prospecting, right, for them first?
Yeah, I was prospecting.
How long were you?
It was only about 2 months. They were really cool. Because I was leaving for work, they said, hey, you can leave, and if you come back, you can pick up where you left off. Because, they didn't have a lot of younger guys at the time, and I think that, they were kind of excited about having some younger guys around. I was from that local scene, so I probably could have brought more people with me potentially. So it didn't really burn any bridges at the time that, they say, if you come back, you can pick up where you left off. But while I was down in Nevada, they actually introduced me with some other clubs out in that area. So I was kind of riding around, just meeting different clubs, hanging out with different people. But that's when I met the Vagos. The Vagos were the first club I had seen that had younger guys in it. A lot of guys from the punk rock scene. Like the Outlaws and stuff. Like I said, some guys from FSU joined the Outlaws, but that was all the way out on the East Coast. Like I didn't see that firsthand where I was at. So all the clubs in Oregon were really old school. So it was that traditional kind of biker look, and there hadn't been much overlap yet. So when I met the Vagos, there was these dudes that were, in a punk rock and skateboarding, and it really connected with me. I really resonated with all of that. So I jumped in head first with those guys and really started hanging around a ton and spending a lot of time with them.
Was there a process because you were prospecting for the other club? Was there a process to go and start prospecting for the Vagos?
Yeah, I think normally I would have prospected for the Vagos, but the chapter I was hanging out with was splitting in two, and they were starting a new chapter. And so I was kind of brought in as a charter member. So I still came in as a probationary member. On paper, I think it was a patch for patch, even though I didn't technically have one with the other club. But I came in and chartered a new chapter, so I didn't end up prospecting.
Wow, you landed into all these roles at a perfect timing, huh?
Yeah, a lot of this stuff wouldn't have happened if timing wasn't right? Like, like I said, when it came to joining the Vagos, eventually when it came to joining the Mongols, stuff like that, it just happened to be the right time at the right place, really, or knowing the right people.
So did you have any dealings with law enforcement when you were with the Vagos?
Not a ton. I had a lot growing up, in that skinhead scene and stuff. I got my first felony assault charge at 16. I got my adult felony assault charge right after turning 18. I had about 6 misdemeanor assault charges by the time I'd moved to Nevada. So, I Ed's probably spent, almost 10 years on probation already, from juvenile and then to adult probation. So I had a lot of experience with law enforcement already. And so I kind of already had my mind made up about how that was going to go. But honestly, as a Vagos, not until I moved back to Oregon. When I moved back to Oregon, I was still a Vago. And I was assigned to the Southern Oregon chapter, which is South Valley chapter Vagos. But I lived up in the Central Valley, so I was almost 3 hours away. And so because I was wearing a patch in an area where they weren't used to us and we weren't normally there, then yeah, that gathered a lot of law enforcement attention. And that's when they started sending informants after us and stuff like that, because they were trying to figure out what we were doing and why we were there.
How many people did you guys have once you went back up to Oregon?
There was always two chapters there was already two chapters of Vagos in Oregon before I came back there. So it was South Valley and North Valley. When I moved home to Eugene and then Salem, which is where I'm from. And there was just me and my twin brother. Some guys would travel through and stuff, but we were attached to the Southern Oregon chapter, and we just have to travel back and forth for church every weekend. So we weren't really trying to start a chapter at the time. We weren't in a position to start a chapter. We were brand new members. So we were just kind of up there hanging out. But anything we did club related, pretty much we'd have to go right down south and spend time with the chapter down in Southern Oregon.
Now, for the people that don't know, like, what's the process if you want to travel across the country and you have your patch? Do you have to let other people know that you're going to ride through the territory?
Yeah, I mean, every club's a little different, but for most club, and especially when you're getting along with other clubs and just out of respect, you usually would call whoever the dominant club in that territory is, and let them know that you were passing through, or whether you were staying, or whether you were just passing through on the way to work, or whatever. But that courtesy heads up would go a long way, and a lot of times that would happen.
No, would they ever say no? You can't come through here with your patches?
I mean, I've heard of times where they didn't want you stopping at bars or like hanging out. Passing through is one thing, but like don't be stopping and hanging out places. I've heard of that before for sure. But honestly, if it was that type of relationship where you thought they were going to tell you no, that might not be something we'll be checking in with anyways, because you don't really want to give them a heads up where you're going to be. So it's kind of up to the club's relationships. If it's a club that's in that area and they're dominant and you're good friends with them, then we would definitely let them know. If it was a club that we were at odds with, we might not.
Yeah, you just speed right through, right?
yeah, pretty much.
Now, once you get your patch, you're up there in Oregon. Did you have any dealings with your opposition, the rival clubs?
Not yet. At the time, the Vagos didn't have a ton of rival clubs. They were just starting to get into it with the Hells Angels in Northern California. So, there was quite a bit of that going on, but it was when I was in Reno and when I was in Oregon, but it was traveling back and forth. Like I'd have to travel to Sacramento to support the chapters that were there, or travel to Redding and try and support the chapters there. But where I physically lived, it wasn't really an issue. I think the biggest thing is the dominant clubs that were there, the Gypsy Jokers and Free Souls, Brother Speed, Outsiders, they were concerned that we were there to start a chapter, which at the time we weren't. So they were keeping a pretty heavy eye on us, but we had the Vagos had a pretty good established relationship with those clubs because they'd been in Oregon for so long. So that was more of they were keeping an eye on where, us kind of encroaching on their area and making sure we weren't, setting up shop in their backyard.
So looking back now, did you sense that they were putting informants in the club, and did you get information after that they did? And can you explain a situation where maybe they did put a
Yeah, they definitely did. But, I was really naive to that situation. I was a young kid in my mid-20s. I didn't know much about that lifestyle yet. From what I knew, we weren't doing anything illegal, outside of defending ourselves or maybe some recreational drug use. There really was no grand conspiracy or no criminal organization. So to me, I couldn't comprehend why law enforcement would care anyways. And then, from movies and books and stuff, all I knew about was undercover agents. I didn't even know what a confidential informant was. I didn't really know that was a thing. I mean, I knew that people would get caught and tell on people, but I didn't realize that they would intentionally plant these guys into chapters or and then get paid to make up stories and tell on people. So I was pretty naive to it. So I definitely ignored a lot of red flags on the first few guys that were coming around, and they'd asked a lot of questions, and, they just did some pretty shady stuff that looking back made some sense. But like I said, I didn't know enough about it. So, honestly, they got what they wanted out of the fact that they had, guys hanging out, asking questions. And, I think all they were figuring out was how many members there were, what our intentions were, stuff like that, because we weren't doing illegal stuff. So I can't imagine there was too much information to give, but it definitely happened for sure.
What was your first dealings with the police once you came back to Oregon, when you had the patch with the Vagos? And how long were you a Vago for?
I was a Vago for 2 years before I switched over to the Mongols, and I was a year in Reno and a year in Oregon, or Carson City, Nevada, right outside of Reno. It wasn't long before getting back into Oregon where I started getting pulled over a lot and, because I said they weren't used to that patch up there. They were kind of wondering what we were doing, who we were there with. The actual first time I got pulled over, I was out riding with my dad. First time we'd ever ridden motorcycles together. And I was in my patch and he was on my brother's bike, and we were out riding around and we got pulled over. And they initially said it was because he didn't have a motorcycle endorsement. But it turned out the cop that pulled us over used to be a corrections officer where my dad went to prison. So he knew my dad right out the gate from prison. So, I'm picking on my dad like, this is your fault. And then the next cop that pulls up was the old school resource officer from my high school that was now a gang cop. So the two cops knew both of us, me and my dad, pretty well. So they ended up impounding his bike, and it turned into quite the ordeal. So that was my first big, first real experience with law enforcement while wearing a patch.
And then did it continued? Like you would get harassed a lot by them?
Yeah, and I mean, looking back, there was some specific law enforcement officers, whether it was local or ATF or federal guys, that were in charge of the motorcycle clubs in that area. So it kind of followed me from Vagos to Mongols. It was the same guys. The same guys would, if we were at a bar with a bunch of us, those would be the guys coming by. Those were the guys paying for the informants. They were the ones asking around. It was always kind of the same ones that were harassing us. And that ended up being the two that, I got arrested for following down the road, where they said I tried to kidnap them, that whole criminal case I had there. So it ended up being the same two for quite a while. And even after that case, I got found not guilty, but I got put on probation for the misdemeanors. And even then they were trying to get me busted all the time and thrown back in jail. And it was a pretty long running thing. In fact, even once I moved out here to Illinois, law enforcement and the outlaw biker investigators unit kind of goes everywhere. And even out here, they tried to harass, but it was all based off these guys from Oregon initially.
Would follow you there, right?
Yeah, or they would tell the gang cops out here, hey, this is where he works. And then they would call my work and try and get me fired, or, just stupid stuff like that.
So what was your first experience once you're a Vago? What was your first experience with violence around you? Whether it was another club member or you were involved with a altercation, what was your first experience?
There wasn't a ton, because the fact that, I came from a pretty violent subculture already, and I was really wanting to prove myself. So I was almost looking for some of those situations. I'm a young, naive kid. I'm not saying that it's cool now by any means, but that, that was where my mindset was back then. And we got into it. There's a funny story I talk about in my book where we get into it with a club called the Over the Hill Club. But I didn't know who they were. They came in and they were bullying around, pushing everybody and trying to act all tough. So started fighting with them, and then I realized the patch on their back said Over the Hill. They're a bunch of old men. But stuff like that. And then it started, I talk about this in my book a bit too, but there was an old agreement in Reno between the Vagos and the Hells Angels that there was a club called the Renegades. That this was before I was in the club, but they had an agreement existed that the Renegades wouldn't be allowed back in Reno. And the Hells Angels reestablished the Renegades in Reno. And so then things started getting pretty tense. And so that's when things started to get pretty serious in that world. And that was kind of my first big taste of, we went from hanging out, riding motorcycles, having fun to, having to watch ourselves around Hells Angels. So that escalated pretty quickly.
Yeah. Are some of your people getting caught by them at different places? And then you're driving around, you have a patch on your back. So it's kind of like you have a target, right?
Right. And you know what? Not yet, because this was more of a Cold War. Everyone was still feeling everything out. I don't think either side was really wanted it yet. We're both kind of, there were still negotiations and talks going on. But once we established a chapter in Reading, they started attacking our guys in Reading, and then that started going to tit for tat and back and forth. So it ended up happening eventually, but initially it was more of waiting to see what was going to happen, and it's more that kind of tense situations.
Would it be like you would go to a bar and fight these guys, or would they just you'd catch them in public?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It wasn't really planned, and if you follow the stuff on the media and stuff, a lot of times it happens at public events, unfortunately, which I have strong beliefs about that and opinions, and I don't think it should go that way. But normally it just happens because they run into each other. So the Vagos are at one bar, and at the time when the Angels didn't get along with them, and they'd find out, or they happened to be there or riding by and see their bikes, or you'd see a guy ride by in the patch. I mean, they're both clubs are highly visible. They're both wearing their patches all the time. So I think it was more chance most of the time, than people would believe. A lot of it wasn't super organized violence. It was just, people would run into each other, and then egos would get the best of it.
Yeah. So then how long until you patch over, and what was that like? What was the approach like for you to even join the Mongols? How did you get introduced to them? And
yeah, when I moved to Nevada when I first moved to Nevada, before I was a Vago or anything, I had met a Mongol, Coconut Dan, who looking back turned out to be a confidential informant, and helped start all of Operation Black Rain. But I didn't really spend any time with him. I just would see him around town, and it was my first never seen a Mongol before. I'd read about them and I knew, I'd heard of them, but I'd never seen one. And the chapter in my area was not very big, and all due respect to them, they weren't the type of people I usually would have hung out with. So I didn't really have a lot of interest in them at the time, but they were growing nationally. I mean, like we were talking about time and place, and this was a time when Doc Cavazos had taken over and he was going on a really heavy recruitment drive, and the Mongols were expanding all over the country. And, they had a website, and every few months it would, welcome this state and welcome that state. And they were all growing pretty quickly. And they had, they started to have a really solid reputation, and they're in the media a lot. And they kind of, became a pretty big name. Not that they weren't before, but they were, getting a lot more popular during that time. At the same time, I was having issues with the Vagos. I was a young kid. I joined something that I don't think I really knew what I was joining. I liked, I drove into motorcycles because I love motorcycles. And so when I found, younger guys that had shared experiences and into punk rock, I didn't think about politics or national levels or how these things work, and so I jumped in, and I really liked the guys in my area, and I met a lot of guys I liked, but I didn't like the political aspect. And at the time, Terry the Tramp was the national president of the Vagos, and was doing some things that a lot of people didn't agree with. And there was a time where the Vagos were fighting Vagos, and we were in that South Valley chapter, and the North Valley chapter had some issues with us. And it got to a point where another member had been killed down in California. And, I started questioning why I was doing, I came in this club for brotherhood and to ride motorcycles. I'm not making money. This wasn't a criminal organization. So why would I want to be worried around my own brothers for my own safety? So I started really thinking about this might not be for me. And, I'd known some Mongols by then, and I knew the Mongols had a rule that Mongols aren't allowed to fight each other. There's nothing that two brothers can't sit down and discuss or talk out, right? That's what real brotherhood should be. So that really intrigued me, and it really kind of attracted to me that. And so I reached out. They had posted on their website that they were welcoming Mongols to Oregon, which turned out was some hoax. I mean, I think there was one guy trying to come around, and they were just trying to flex that they were growing. But someone from their national leadership reached out and called me and invited me to a meeting. And so I sat down with the Vagos in my chapter, and we were all pretty disgruntled. We'd already been talking a lot. We'd gone down to the Vagos Nationals and tried to sit down with some of the national leadership and, voice our concerns and what we were upset about. We weren't feeling heard. And initially our whole chapter wanted to leave. And so I said, well, hey, I'm going to go to this meeting. Potentially we could do this. And so I flew out to Florida, and I had this meeting with the Mongols. I was out there while they were having a meeting with the Outlaws, which was the first time I actually physically seen any Outlaws. Talk about that quite a bit in my book too, that experience. But we went through some stuff out there, and I was invited to join. And so when I moved home, I started the first chapter of the Mongols in Oregon.
So when you went out there, you had your patch on when you went to
I was wearing a t-shirt that said Vagos on it. I had my soft patch. The Vagos have a rule: you can't wear your patch anywhere unless you ride your bike there, which I always respected and appreciated. But because I flew there, I could only wear a t-shirt that said Vagos on it, but I couldn't wear my actual patch.
How many people did you go there with?
I went there by myself.
What? By yourself?
Yeah, well, looking back, it wasn't the smartest move, man. I didn't even know any Mongols. I flew out there. Some Mongols picked me up from the airport, took me to an Airbnb. It was back then, it was a condo. It was before Airbnb existed, but same concept. And just stayed with a bunch of strangers and went everywhere they went. And I've spent 4 days with them, and went to some meetings with them, and just really got to know each other.
There was no uneasy feeling when you were there or anything like that?
No, not really. I mean, I guess there was potential where there could have been, but no, it was. I guess if I went out there and maybe was really disrespectful or didn't, I don't know. I think it was pretty safe. I was pretty naive in the fact that I was excited about it anyways. But I clicked with the guys right away. I knew it was a good fit. I knew as soon as I got there, this is where I was supposed to be. This was the family I wanted to be a part of, and it clicked right away.
So now when you fly back, what's the process of telling them? Can you walk me through what that day was like?
Yeah, it's kind of sketchy, right? So, I want to tell my our chapter's already discussing it a little bit. So the first thing is we have a meeting, and the whole chapter wants to know what's going on. The reason I say it's sketchy is because everyone says they're on board, but you don't know who's running off telling so-and-so, or, and so you don't know what your safety is around a group of guys that may or may not really be doing this with you. Right. And you can imagine it's a pretty disrespectful move to leave one club for another, and things could potentially get violent or pretty dangerous for doing that. So we went back, sat down, had this meeting. At the time, the whole chapter said they were on board. But I think what happened is, there were certain guys that realized this might be their chance for leadership, or their chance to progress in the club they were in, even though they said they were unhappy. and it kind of turned into some backstabbing and things going on behind the back. And so we agreed to have another meeting, follow up, and I could kind of tell in between that meantime things were getting sketchy. People weren't being, you know what I mean? You could just tell. So half of us chose to leave, and we packed up all of our stuff, and we gave it to the sergeant of arms that we were still friends with at the time, and respectfully turned over all club property, so there was no issue there. And any dues or any, we tried to make it as amicable as possible.
So you lay your patch down, or do you bring it to a table? Like what do you do? Put it in a box and send it to them?
No, I mean, we handed it all over in person. We just scheduled a meeting to meet up, and we had I had duffel bags full of T-shirts and jewelry and patch, and just handed it over, and they go through and make sure everything's there. And at the time, we shook hands and said, best of luck, and moved on. But things escalated pretty quick after that for a little bit. But I get it. Part of it, like I said, was pretty disrespectful on our end. I understand, there's rules against that stuff. In this day and age, I don't think the Vagos are a club you can leave and join the Mongols. They have agreements. Those two clubs have agreements that you can't do that. Like I said, it was a time and a place, right? It was a time that Doc was really expanding and was allowing guys from other clubs. A lot of times you can't go from one major club to another major club. At the time, with all due respect to the Vagos, at the time the Vagos weren't as big as they were now. They didn't claim to be a 1%er club back then. So there were some things that worked in my favor, timing wise.
Yeah.
But yeah, we just handed everything over, and then then the rumor mill started going and the shit talking started happening. And then I talked about this in my book too, but a federal agent came to my house and said that, that the Vagos had a hit out on me and my brother. And, they were at a duty to warn or some stuff, some stupid shit like that. So things escalated, but thankfully never got too serious. There was a couple little skirmishes, but nobody got hurt. And, time went by and things, time passes. And thankfully I rebuilt a lot of relationships with a lot of those guys, but it took a lot of time. That's for sure. I mean, this was 2006 when this was happened, 2007 when this happened. So
almost 20 years ago.
Yeah. I joined the Mongols of November of 2007.
So after you give them all the property back, what was the process? Did you go back home? Did you go and meet them and get your new patch?
No, I went back home. There was kind of a little lag time. And then I went down to the group of us went down to Reno. And at the time, the Mongols were doing somewhere you kind of had to interview. I mean, interviews are kind of a silly term, but you sat there and talked to some of the leadership guys, and it's kind of the final step to make sure if they want you in the club or not. And so I had to sit down with some intimidating guys that had big reputations and answer a bunch of questions and spend the evening with them. And then they voted to decide if we can join or not. And they obviously voted that we could. And then the next day we were awarded our patches.
What's it like when they hand you that patch?
It's pretty crazy, man. I mean, I'm at the time I was 27 years old, 26 years old. And I'd always heard of the Mongols, once I started getting into bikers, and they had this pretty crazy reputation. And, the Vagos, a lot of the ones I met and a lot of the other clubs are like hard party and hard riding clubs. And they have a lot of tough guys and they're tough clubs. And I don't take that away from them. But the Mongols had this reputation of all seriousness at the back, especially back then. It was like, it was all seriousness. And it seemed like it was like next level. So it was, it was intimidating, but it was also a rush. It was thrilling. But, you put it on and instantly go, well, Hell's Angels are looking for me and cops are looking for me. But the Brotherhood was next level. So it was exciting, man. And honestly, it was really exciting.
Yeah, because they have to vote. Like, what was it like waiting for them to vote? You're like sitting there like, oh, shit.
Right, because, if they voted no, and I already left the other club I was in, I guess that was it for club life for me, right? That would have been the end of the road, so.
Yeah. So they end up giving it to you. What was your next step? What did you do from there? You were in Reno when you met them, right?
Yeah, so the group of us went back to Oregon. Now we had our patches. There was
How
two
many
guys.
of you?
There was four that went on the trip, and then two that we came back to. So we started the chapter with 6. Now there was no Mongols in Oregon. The nearest chapter was like San Jose, so there was no chapters even near us. And again, not something that Mongols would probably do today, or most clubs. We wouldn't start that far away. And we knew damn well that all these clubs that we grew up respecting and looking up to weren't going to want us there. So, like when we were Vagos, we spent a lot of time with the Free Souls, and they were based out of Eugene. And at the time, that's where we were going to start this first Mongol chapter. So the very first thing we did when we got home, is I called the president of the Free Souls and asked for a sit down. And I think it pretty much took him by surprise, because I don't think anyone really knew what we were up to.
Walk me through that situation when you go there. to meet
Yeah, I
them
mean,
both?
security was tight on my end, right? Because I didn't know how it was going to go, and I knew they weren't going to be happy. And it was, I mean, it was a tough situation for me as well because I knew this was going to be a disrespectful move. I knew this was going to upset these guys, and I completely understood why. But on the flip, I couldn't ask their permission. I wasn't going to let them tell me no. So I had to be stern in the fact of, hey, we're here now.
You're
Um,
basically going to tell them. You're not going to
yeah,
ask them,
we
right?
didn't ask, and we did that with all the clubs eventually in Oregon. We sat down with all of them, and essentially what we would tell them is, hey, we're here. We're not going anywhere. We'd love to coexist. We can, we could ignore each other for all we care. And especially as I grew in the club world and kind of because I ended up expanding the club all over the Midwest and into some other countries and into Australia. And a lot of what I tell these other clubs is, with all due respect, we don't we kind of come from a different the type of people that join Mongols might not be the same type that join these other clubs. So there's not an overlap. So we usually don't go to the same type of bars. We're not recruiting the same type of people. We're not really stepping on each other's toes. And so a lot of times there'd be agreements like we wouldn't take any of their ex-members or ex-hangarounds, those types of things out of respect. But the initial conversation was just, hey, we're here and we could coexist, or I guess we'll have to do what we have to do and see how it goes.
Were any of them really pissed off about it?
Yeah, every one of them. Yeah, there was a big article in the Oregonian newspaper a few months after we started that was talking about this impending biker war, and there was the Free Souls were having a big anniversary party in Eugene, and I wanted to make a statement and a present, so I decided that we'd all get together. All eight of us at this point, right? Like I think there was over 100 of the other guys. It was all the other clubs together. It was all eight of us, and we wanted to show we weren't scared. So we just rode around all day in our patches, going to the bars that they hang out at and frequent at. And it started the pot, right? It essentially threw the rock at the bee's nest on that one. And some feds had pulled over a car that had the local presidents of all the major clubs, and they had a trunk full of guns and had said, the word on the street was they were looking for us. Now, thankfully, that didn't play out like that, and it didn't happen. But that describes the situation early on. That's how tense it was.
Wow. I can't even imagine, man. You're like basically a sitting duck or a
Right.
riding duck, right?
Yeah, and within it, a year and a half, 2 years, I went from riding motorcycles with my friends to wanting to have more friends to ride motorcycles with to damn near being at war. And so, it was a lot to take in, but you really didn't even have the time to think about it. You just kind of had to react and stand your ground. Because if you show any sort of weakness, or if we were going to say, if we were going to let you tell us where we can and can't go, or we can and can't do, it was going to be a uphill battle. So we just kind of held our mud, and thankfully over the years, our relationships with those local clubs got better and better. And they saw that, I was a man of my word, and the fact that we wouldn't step on their toes, and we're going to take their ex-members. And for the most part, we didn't even hang out at the same places. And eventually we established really good relationships with those clubs in that state. But, it took 10 to 15 years.
So you guys didn't take any of their members at all?
No, no,
What about them taking your members?
no,
None of that happened?
no. I mean, this was with all those Oregon clubs I was talking about. But yeah, that didn't happen.
So what about the police contact when you have the Mongols patch on, and what was that like?
It intensified. I think a lot of it intensified because, the media and everything else was saying how, this big biker war was going to happen. At that same time, there was 3 confidential informants around our chapter that were stoking the flames. They would, hey, the Free Soul said this, and hey, these guys said that. And we're always trying to instigate and start shit. And then who knows what they were going back and telling law enforcement. But that first year was pretty crazy. So, I joined the club with not much experience. We're the only chapter in the state. So by de facto, I'm the chapter president. Never been, in leadership in a motorcycle club before. I'm like 26 years old. And I was figuring it out as we go. And then shortly thereafter, I'm in California at a club run, and I'm notified that, the club, and I won't say who, but the club was having an issue with a pretty major organization outside of the motorcycle world. And it was very violent, and it was very dangerous. And so, that was right after joining. And then on top of that, all this law enforcement stuff's happening. And then in April of 2008, so I'd been in 8 months, is when I got hit with all those charges for chasing those cops. And I, was sat in jail on a $14 million bail for 2 months.
What was that situation? Can you walk me through what happened that day?
Yeah, and I give a lot of the details in my book about it, but the overview.
And I'll put a link in the description of this video. You can go buy his book. He's going to give you some of it, but not all of it. Make sure you go check out his book.
The overview of it is, these feds were surveying my property, I guess, because of, this impending biker war. This was like a day after that newspaper article came out. So tensions are high. Everyone's on high alert. and I was staying at my brother's house, and he lived like on a little over 100 acres out in the country. So not a place where you would get lost, right? And I'm in a pickup truck driving down the lane, and an all black SUVs, Ford Explorers, coming towards me, tinted windows, and so I'm kind of figuring out who it is. I stop, I look at them, they take off, so I follow them. Um, and I followed them about 30 miles back into town, and they went to the Gypsy Jokers Clubhouse, which was the main club in Oregon, and the club that we thought we were going to have issues with. And they sat out front, so you can imagine I assumed it was enemies, right?
I think it's them, right? You think
Yeah,
it's them.
absolutely. So I made some phone calls, and every time I tried to get next to the car, they, I was like chasing them. I get next to them, they would take off. They wouldn't let me see who they were. So I figured that if I could get some other people on the road with some cars I wouldn't recognize, we could very least identify these people, right? Get a look in the
Block
car.
them in a little bit so you can get a
see who they are, right? So they got back on the freeway, and this time they headed south, and I followed them for an hour. So it was 60 miles. I mean, this whole thing was like a 90-mile trip. So it was a couple hours. And we did just that. We started to block them in to see who they were. And they hit their lights and sirens. And because we blocked them in, they said it was a attempted kidnapping and conspiracy to commit kidnapping on federal agents. So it's all over the news. I was held on this, it was $14 million, and then it was $1.4 million bail.
Wait, how did they pull you over? Like, well, you blocked them in, and then what? They just put the lights on.
They hit their lights and sirens, and pretty much everyone else took off. and I wasn't really worried at the time, so that I took the exit, but slowly with my signals, and they were in front of me. And I was like, what did I do? I followed a car. I don't give a shit. Like, what could I possibly get in trouble for, right? Yeah. And it didn't take long before I was surrounded by cops and guns drawn, and even then I wasn't worried at all, because I was like, I didn't do anything. I followed somebody. I didn't realize how out of proportion they were going to blow it. But yeah, so they had me for a conspiracy to commit kidnapping and attempted kidnapping on federal agents. So I fought that. I obviously won because I wasn't guilty, but I did get found guilty of misdemeanor reckless driving. And the judge, because she was so pissed I got away with it, put me on 5 years felony gang probation. And part of that was a non-association. So I wasn't allowed to hang out at the club. So anytime I did, I'd have to go back to jail. And
even your own brother, right? Your
absolutely.
own brothers, your twin brothers in the club.
And I think I violated 4 or 5 times. And every time I went back, it was for a month or 2 at a time. So now I'd been a Mongol probably 10 months. And I was like, well, I still want to be a Mongol. So I said, fuck it, I'm moving to California then. Or, they're not going to extradite me on a misdemeanor warrant from Southern California. So I transferred down to the San Diego chapter, which, I figured this way I can learn more about being a Mongol. San Diego is a really well-respected, well-regarded chapter. So I can learn, a lot about what Mongol life was like, be a better leader when I came back to Oregon. And I was there for a couple of months. And in October, Operation Black Rain came to an end. And, 80 something Mongols were arrested all over the country. My whole chapter was arrested. And, it was,
so you were scooped up with that too, right?
Yeah.
But did you still have a warrant for this stuff you did up there?
Yeah. So everyone in my chapter pretty much got hit in those raids. I had left. I went and stayed on some Indian reservation thinking that would help me, but it was a federal warrant. It wouldn't have helped me any. I was just trying to figure things out. And I decided, I don't want to go to jail and sit in California just to get extra at home. So I drove home and turned myself in, did a couple months there, got kicked out, and was back in Oregon. So, that was my first year in the Mongols. All of that stuff happened. And the fact that I stuck through it and stayed looking back is pretty crazy. But at the time, I tunnel vision. I wanted to be the best Mongol I could be. And I'd signed up for it. And I was going to do what I had to do.
So what was it like when you get arrested and they bring you to jail? What's it like to be a 1%er in jail?
It's probably different state by state. Oregon's pretty relaxed. I feel like I'm a respectful dude, and I never really had any issues at all. Most of the time you normally would get brought in and put in a gen pop, and, people will figure each other out and show your paperwork and all that simple stuff. But because my crime was against cops, they had me on 23.5-hour a day lockdown in a single cell. So I didn't even really have interaction with much other inmates. I almost took the plea bargain because I was so bored out of my mind. I was like, I'd rather just go to prison at this point, because they'd serve me my meals in jail, in my cell. So I'd get out for a shower and a phone call, and then I'd be back in my cell. You get some yard time where you get to interact with other people, but not much, because it was all like the high profile people. So it'd be like 1 or 2 guys out at a time.
How much time were they offering you during your time going to court?
The plea bargain was for 2 years. So I was like, oh, that's not too bad. And I'm sitting here in county jail. It can't be much worse than this. But, I honestly believed I was innocent. I didn't want to take the win, or, agree that I didn't want to concede to something that I didn't believe was true. So I fought it, and turned out, I could have got a lot of time over it. But
Yeah.
thankfully I didn't. So my sentence for my misdemeanor, the max you can get for a misdemeanor in Oregon is 1 year in county jail, and that's what they sentenced me to. But the jails were overcrowded. I was there for reckless driving, so they have a thing called the matrix, sentencing guideline, the matrix, and they look at who's a violent offender, what's the risk to the population, and so once I got sentenced to this year, and they're trying to make room in the jail, I got kicked out within like 2 days because I was there for reckless driving. So I did 2.5 months out of that year, but I ended up doing the full year because, like I said, every time I got caught for hanging out, I go back for a month or two at a time. So I ended up doing about a whole year, anyways, off and on.
So
And then 2
can
months
you
of road
walk
crew.
me can you walk me through a situation where you got caught when you're not supposed to be around these guys? And were
You
you
know what?
wearing your patch?
Well, I'd get caught because we had the informants, so the informants would tell, and then I would go to like one time I went to see my PO like for my weekly visits, and he was like, "Hey, congratulations." I said, "For what?" He goes, "For getting voted back in as president." I was like, "I don't know what you're talking about." He's like, "Oh, you don't got to lie." In handcuffs. And then another time, we go see my PO, no problems, go home, then wake up one morning, knock on the door. There's my PO. Yep, we know you're with the club again in handcuffs. So someone would, the informants were telling on me, and then I would just get picked up at home or in my probation visit.
Wow. So it must have been pretty nerve-wracking to know that you could be scooped up and brought back to jail.
Yeah,
Like,
man, it was super stressful. And I, like I said, I wasn't allowed to hang out with my brother, and he had just had a baby at the time, and I was helping babysit. So anytime I'd babysit, I'd have to let my PO know, and then I have to say that my brother wasn't going to be there, and they would stop by and check a lot of times, and it would get to the point that if I was getting arrested so much that if they knocked on the door just to check, my heart rate was through the roof because I was like, well, I guess I'm going to jail today.
yeah,
So I didn't have a job at the time. There was just a lot. It was just going back and forth in jail so much.
yeah. So what was your first interaction with you were around little Dave, right?
Yeah.
And so when did you first meet little Dave? And there's a lot of talk if he was an informant and all this stuff, if he was working with law enforcement, right?
Yeah, there was. I think he was pretty much vindicated in that after that trial that recently happened, where they were trying to, the Mongols were trying to prove he was an informant to help their case, and they had all the paperwork and talked to all the agencies, and literally zero evidence to support that he ever was an informant or ever provided any sort of information. So I think he was vindicated on that. But I first met him. I was in jail when he first took over. So Doc Cavazos was the national P, and then Doc got thrown out, and another guy had taken over, and then Black Rain hit, and pretty much that whole chapter got decimated. The national leadership chapter, they call it Mother Chapter, and most of the Mother Chapter got arrested. And so the Secretary Treasurer had stepped up, and he was like the acting president, and he had brought little Dave back, who at the time was out bad or maybe retired. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know much of the story back then, so I could be wrong. But either ways, they brought him back, and he was helping out and overseeing Mother Chapter. And in the next election, he was voted in as national president. So this was 2009, 2010, probably 2009. And so I was in and out of jail back then, so I wasn't super active. So I didn't even meet him until a little bit later on, and I started spending time with him around 2011. And it was the end of 2011 that I was brought into Mother Chapter. So that's when I started to get to know him more, because that was when I got involved in national leadership.
Now, do you think that once Doc Cavasso got involved with recruiting people, because I've seen some things where he was reaching in and getting people that were involved with gangs and things like that, and some people were saying that was a big mistake to get people like that involved.
Yeah, I don't know how prevalent it was. I will say, like I said, I joined a motorcycle club because I love motorcycles. So when I meet new members, a lot of things I'd say is, what kind of bike do you ride? And under the Doc era, there was a few times someone would say, oh, I don't ride, or I'm from the streets. But honestly, it was few and far between. So I don't know how prevalent that really was. I was up in Oregon when this was happening, and I came in at the end of that era. So I can't speak too much on that because I'm not 100% sure. Almost every Mongol I ever met rode motorcycles. The big difference is when little Dave took over, and because of that rumor, he made it a point that we started going out in big pack rides all the times. Mongols had to have a bike. We had to ride. Another member, the one by the name of Bang Bang, he was getting really into YouTube, and he was making all these videos, and it was putting positive stuff out on the internet, which was just big club rides and pack rides. But it was really a big point to show that the Mongols are a motorcycle club that rides motorcycles.
Yeah, because I think law enforcement thinks that these guys sit around and just talk about crime all day.
I think it's that narrative benefits them, right? They'll say, Well, yeah, they're not motorcycle enthusiasts. They're ex-gang members from the streets. They're all criminals selling drugs, and they're in this organized crime. It's an easier narrative to spin, and it's easy for people to pick up because what's the population be more scared of? You know, bunch of guys that left gang life to better themselves and be with brothers and ride motorcycles, or guys that stepped their way up in this criminal organization. You know, like what they call it, the mob on wheels and all this bullshit like that. So,
Yeah.
I think it benefits their narrative more than it is fact.
Yeah, I think some of the members maybe get involved with drugs, but that's not them as a whole. You know what I
Yeah, and
mean?
absolutely, and you'll see it like in 2008, that Black Rain. There was, you know, a handful of guys that were doing stuff they shouldn't have been doing, but no one else was profiting from it. And that was another thing when Little Dave took over. He changed. Everyone had to have a visible means of income. You had to, it didn't have to be a 9 to 5, but you had to have, a full time job or retirement or something to show where you get your money, because one guy gets caught selling drugs, it makes everyone look bad. I do think it was proven that even in that racketeering case and stuff, that guys that were selling drugs, they weren't paying percentage up. It wasn't going to the chapter or to the national, and it is not and was not ever a criminal organization.
And what was your thoughts when they were trying to take the patch away?
And it was crazy. I mean, it was so surreal that you'd think that they could even happen. And a lot of people don't know, but that when it first happened, when they physically did take everyone's patch, they were able to pull people over and take their patch from them. They were breaking into cars, breaking into houses, taking club property. If a motorcycle had Mongols painted on it, they were taking motorcycles. Like, it was absolutely ludicrous. And I don't think a lot of people knew that at the time. And the judge had come out and said that she was misled and didn't realize that the government was trying to overreach like that, and put an injunction on that so that they weren't allowed to take our patches, but we weren't allowed to wear them at the time. And then, pretty quickly we were able to get them back while it was all going through court. And that case lasted 11 years before it
So
finally
they pulled you over and took your patch too?
Initially, yeah, within that first year. So that first year that happened, all the Mongols had a T-shirt that just said MFFM and Black and White Nation on the back, but there was no patches. It's like a picture of a national run where we're probably down to 200 members, and everyone was just wearing T-shirts because we didn't have patches.
That's wild, man. Isn't it? There's rules about your patch, right? Your patch is sacred to you. You can't let it
Yeah. Every club's different as far as what the rules are, but definitely it's the most important thing there is, in the club.
Yeah. So now, when people go to these motorcycle rallies and there's two clubs that go, and sometimes altercations break out, what do you think the solution is to that problem?
Well, honestly, I think that if say you're a club that has beef with another club and it's a rival area, I just think you should just stay away from it. You know what I mean? What's the point in going there and having this pissing contest or stepping on each other's toes? But I also believe that no matter who shows up, when you're in public around all these people, it's a bad look for everybody when shit kicks off. And I'm not saying that anyone that did it before was in the wrong. I'm also not saying it's right, but I'm saying if you think bigger picture, all these national runs, these big motorcycle rallies, now all of a sudden the one percenters are the bad guys. They're unwelcomed. People are scared of them. You're not, no one wants you there. And who wants to show up to a place where you're unwanted? Everyone's, the cops are following you around half the time, like Daytona and all these places are no patches allowed now. So it creates so much disadvantage for the clubs, or it's such a black eye to club life that, in a perfect world, they would ignore each other. And if there was still beef, they can handle it privately. But, I also know how ego gets, and one guy looks at another guy for too long and things happen, right? But in a perfect world, I'd wish everyone could at least coexist in public.
So you ended up getting a tattoo of the Mongols, pretty big tattoo on the back of your head, right?
Yeah. I would have been in maybe 2 months when I got that tattoo.
2 months.
Yeah. The Mongols have rules now that are a little bit different, but at the time there wasn't a rule against getting a club tattoo right away, and I figured, hey, I'm all in. I was at the time I joined too, I was one of the few white guys in the club. The club's pretty mixed now, but at the time it was very California centric, and it was a lot of Hispanics. And, Oklahoma obviously had white guys in it. A couple other, Colorado had some, but we were, Oregon was one of the first bigger group of white guys initially. And so, I was trying to find my mark and find my place in the club, and I thought that was a good idea. And what had happened was that, I got that from my brother when I was in Nevada. I was traveling back and forth to Nevada a lot. And when that newspaper article I was talking about came out, they had taken some pictures of us riding around, and they took that famous picture of the back of my head. But because it was used by the media, it's what they call media stock, which means anybody could use it and not have to pay for it. And so then it started being used everywhere for everything. You know, when Mongols started in Canada, the picture was there. When Mongols started in Australia, that's the picture they used. Like it made its rounds for several years.
Yeah, so your tattoo is now it's part of the legacy, right?
Yeah, yeah. I ended up when I left the club, I ended up covering it up. You know, I didn't want to represent something that I was no longer a part of, and I didn't want to be people to think I was a part of something I wasn't a part of. So that was kind of an end of an era for me. I mean, I was like closing the final chapter of when I left was covering that tattoo up.
Is there anything you regret from when you were part of the 1% club?
Man, I don't think so. You know, I don't really believe in regrets. I learned a lot from. I mean, I made a lot of mistakes. Don't get me wrong, but I've learned a lot from them, and I think a lot of that has shaped me for the man I am today. I had a great time in the 1% world. I had a blast. You know, I had all these stories from being on the road, riding motorcycles with some of my very best friends. So it's hard to regret any of that. You know, I'm happy to have moved on. I'm very happy with where my life is now. You know, I regret some relationships. You know, I regret some of the political relationships that got changed over because of club politics and people that I was friends with in other clubs. I regret some relationships I had within the club that, because I was following rules and people got put out bad, I didn't stay in touch with. So, some things like that. But overall, no, I don't really have any major regret.
So I don't know if you were in the club or out of the club at the time, but there was a guy who got killed. He got murdered, right? He got stabbed in somewhere in the Midwest.
Oh, the Mongol that got shot in Lake of the Ozarks.
What, the Lake of the Ozarks? That was your good friend, right?
Yeah, I'm the one that brought him into the club. I was still active at the time too.
So do you know what happened with that situation?
Yeah, it was just the Mongols had started in that area. It was a lot like Oregon. It started in that area, and a lot of the local clubs said they didn't want them there. And a club called the Galloping Goose said that there would never be Mongols there. And we made it a point to show them that we would be there. And at one point, I brought over 200 something Mongols to a motorcycle rally in Lake of the Ozarks to show, hey, we're here. But same type of thing, public event, daytime. It was a biker event, and they had instigated a fight. And this brother said, you know what, we'll take care of this later, and was leaving. And they ended up shooting and killing him. So
He's a young kid too.
yeah.
So what happened for you to be like, I'm walking away from this? And what was it like to walk away from the club?
Man, it was a challenge, right? I was almost, it was coming up on my 15th year as in membership. Starting to get pretty burnt out on politics. Little Dave had, all this stuff was going on with Little Dave, and he'd gotten thrown out. People were labeling him a rat. So there was this big power struggle and power vacuum, and people weren't trusting each other, not like in a violence way, but just, who's trying to run against who. And people that had influence were taking away, some of the power and influence of other people. And I'd spent a really long time doing what I felt was best for the club. And I'd created a national support club, a lot of different bylaws and rules that, that I'd helped create, a couple different programs that I'd helped run. And it got to the point where, enough people were asking me to run for national president that I don't know if anyone took it that serious or not, but I would say that the current leadership or the guys that were in leadership at the time started taking away some of my position of authority, and started changing some of the stuff that I'd built. And if it was for the best, I wouldn't have had a problem with it. But it was hard. It was hard to stomach. So I was starting to get pretty burnt out. At the same time, Scoops, the brother from Lake of the Ozarks, had just got killed. So that was weighing really heavy on my mind because it was a guy I brought into the club against my better judgment for that very reason. We were having a lot of issues with other clubs in the Midwest, and it was I was really burnt out, and I started feeling like I just didn't have the same beliefs and values I had early on, or I think even differently as the club's core values changed. And I found myself being that old guy that was like, oh, it used to be like this, it used to be like this. And a lot of the new guys didn't want that anymore. And so the program I ran or the position I felt was best for the club, I don't think others shared that same vision anymore. And so what would be the point? If that would be selfish of me to try and pull everyone back to something I wanted when no one else wanted it. So I just thought the best bet was to, move on.
So what was it like the day that you laid your patch down? And can you walk me through that?
Well, initially I retired. So if you're a Mongol for more than 10 years, you're allowed to leave in good standings, keep your patch, keep your club property. So
are you at a club? Are you at a meeting when you do this?
No, I went to an all president's meeting. And then I went to a national run in Miami. And when I came home, that's when I was starting to I'd read the room. The vibes were good. I was starting to think I might even get kicked out. And so I wanted to kind of do it on my terms. And so I called the national chapter and let them know, ask permission to retire, let them know I was retiring. I was allowed to retire in good standings. Everything was good. And then some things happened later that changed my status out bad, but you can read about that part in my book. I'm going to leave that one hanging.
Yeah, go check out his book. I'll leave a link in the description of this video. And you gave me a lot of information, man. Now, there's probably someone watching right now who's maybe a part of a club or wants to be a part of a club. What's your advice you would have to that person?
Hang around as long as you can, for no matter what club it is, what you see is what you get for the most part. So really read it. How do they treat each other? How do they treat each other's families? How do they treat each other's old ladies? What's that lifestyle really look like? And really, really consider, outside of all the excitement, really consider, is this the lifestyle for me? Because it is for a lot of people. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but you really got to make sure it's the right fit. Too many people jump in without knowing what they're getting involved in, and they end up being out in bad standings, or like the brother Scoops, you could get killed. There's so much that goes into it with the very, very, heavy consequences if it doesn't go right. So spend as much time as you can and make sure it's the right fit for you, and make sure you find the right group of guys. Your chapter should be your best friends. Those should be guys that you'd be hanging out with or without a patch. And if you can find that, it's probably going to be a great fit, but just don't force the fit.
Now, you want to tell people where they could get your book and what do you got going on for the future?
Yeah, so my book, it's called The Ride of My Life. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere that any Kindle store. I don't have the audiobook yet, but everything else is available. I do have a YouTube channel called Mondays with Mooch. I have not been very active on it lately, but it's where I go in there and just kind of share some of my stories and talk about my past a bit. And then, right now I'm going to start working on the audiobook pretty soon. I've been jumping on some shows like this. I got some other shows coming up and really just trying to promote the book, trying to get the book out there as much as I can and, get my story out there and see, keep a positive spin on it and see how I can help others.
Are you going to narrate the audio?
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be good, man. I think you put some emotions behind it. It'll be
Absolutely.
a great listen,
Yeah, no, I'm excited to do it. The publisher had already agreed to do it. We just got to kind of get the logistics of it down and get started on it.
I wish you nothing but success in the future. Thank you, man. I really appreciate it. And I'll leave a link in the description of this video if you want to check out his book. And I look forward to seeing more of you in the future.
All right, man. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks, man. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can get my videos every time they drop. And if you don't like this show, too fucking bad. Start your own podcast. Peace.